So many things out there that don't contain biblical truth. It's almost like passive aggression from the devil who wants to come in and tell you, no, you can't be like this old book that was written. You need to do things your way, the way of the culture, the way of things going. Let me tell you something. The culture has invaded the church way too long. I'm done with the culture, I'll be honest with you. I know we got to relate to them. I know we got to go down and meet people where they're at. But we got to help them come to be where God wants them to be. And it's not going to be us going down into the culture. It'll be them coming up to us. And that's because we walk in light and the truth. But it can be so subtle. My prayer in this message today, as we look at the temptation that Joseph dealt with, and we all see these big temptation of a woman coming after him. I think there's a lot of little itty-bitty temptations that get to us every single day. I always contend it's not the big 10, the big 10 commandments that we all have problems with every single day. Hopefully, none of you woke up this morning. I hope I don't kill anyone today. You know what I mean? But that's what we do. We make these big proclamations. But then at the same time, all of us have these one or two or three things that God just is waiting for us to be delivered from. And that he's waiting to do something amazing in our lives, but we struggle with these same stupid things in our lives that the enemy just keeps putting before us. So my prayer is that it's not always the big things, sometimes it's the little things. But the thing that was cool about Joseph is we only get to hear the big things, but a lot of years go by. And I think there were probably a lot of little things that he had to overcome. Because what I believe in this message is that favor from God, favor follows faithfulness. You have to be faithful, and then God's favor comes. In 1978, a psychiatrist named M. Scott Peck, he published this hugely, wildly popular book. It was called The Road Less Traveled. Many of you might have heard about it. It's not a Christian book, but it does contain some great biblical truth. In the opening sentence in the book, it's just this 3-word sentence. Life is difficult. Period. And every reader and every listener in the room today can identify with that truth. One of the privileges and honors I have as a pastor is to be privy to the hard stuff that many of you go through. And it never ceases to amaze me how brutal life can be. The challenges and trials we're sometimes called to cope with, that we're called to cope with, seems unfair. Why is God piling on so much onto me? And I don't believe it is God, to be honest with you. I think there are times we have piled some stuff on our own. Sometimes we've opened the door to the enemy to pile stuff on. But there are times where God says, listen, I'm going to give you this because, man, come on, you got to toughen up. How many know if you want to get stronger and you're lifting weights, you have to add weight here and now and then to make it heavier? Some of you are recovering from a season of trials. You're finally past this thing you've been dealing with. Since every one of us has gone through or is going through or will go through a trial, each of us needs to learn how to navigate without letting it crush our faith, without letting it crush our hope, without letting it crush our love for God and for others. So this series called The Life of Joseph, we're going to see Joe go through some pretty tough trials. And it's been said that life is a series of peaks and valleys, and no one probably knows that better than Joseph. Yet through all of his trials, Joseph learned to trust God overall. That he believed that God had a sovereign plan over his life. Now, did that make him special? No. All of us, God has a sovereign plan. It's pretty amazing to think of it that way. And we fight it all the time, I think. I know if we're a kid, it's hard sometimes when our parents have sovereign plans for us. You go, no, I'm going to have my own path. I'm going to do my own thing. Unless you got praying parents, and they're training a child in the way that God has made them, not in the way that they want them to be. Instead, we look and we say, gosh, look at that. Look how God created that child. Look at the bent in that child. Look at how that child is. And then we go, wow, look how God created him. That's how we need to raise them, walk them through that direction. Every kid is different, and we're all different. And God wants to shape us in the same way. And because of his choice, Joseph's choice to trust God through the trials, Joseph remains resilient. I want to be resilient. You ever have those weeks or months where it's just one thing after another, after another, after another, and then finally things seem okay, and then the car breaks down. It's like that last straw. But Joseph, in his last straw, seems to constantly be resilient. He doesn't just survive. He thrives. I want to live like that. Instead of allowing the struggles he encountered to sour his faith to God, he trusts God through each trial and allows it to deepen his dependence on God. So many people walk away from God because they go, well, this just ain't working out for me. God doesn't seem to care what I'm going through. Look what is happening to me. And instead of running to God, they run away from him. So here's what Joseph concludes after facing the greatest challenge of his life. It's our verse throughout this entire series. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. This is the theme verse. I hope you'll memorize it, because no matter what you go through, you can depend on this verse. And in case you weren't with us last week, real quickly, and Joseph's trials began, he was raised in a fairly dysfunctional family. And as we learned last week, dysfunction unchecked leads to disaster unleashed. And this family came to a crisis when Joseph was 17. His father, well, any family is in a crisis when your child turns 17. Yeah, right? His father had unwisely shown Joseph over the top favoritism, and his brothers grew intensely and increasingly jealous. To make matters worse, Joseph arrogantly or naively shared the contents of his dreams. This is where a lot of people feel that Joseph went wrong. We talked about how he has these dreams where his brothers will bow down to him, and a second dream where his brothers and even his father and mother will bow down to him. And many people will, well, and I've heard many sermons, well, this is Joseph's downfall, his pride. Oh, look what I'm showing you, you're all bowed down to me. Whereas I more take the other view that Joseph was just naive. He didn't understand what these were, and he was just sharing them. Either way, he should have learned from the first time not to share the second one. So that's what basically is happening. And that maneuver was more than the brothers could handle. And they were just going to kill him. But instead they sold him as a slave to these Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. And they led their father Jacob to believe that an animal had devoured him and he was dead. That's where we left off last week. So now we're in Genesis 39, chapter 1. It says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. And then his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted his care to everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of the household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessings of the Lord were on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Good choice, Potiphar. I mean, I would be concerned. I wouldn't trust anybody with that. I mean, they're going to have to ask me what I want to eat. I don't care how powerful you get. You got to be concerned about what you're eating. Jewish historian Alfred Elderstein tells us that Potiphar, I never read this before until that historian was talking about, Potiphar was chief of the executioners. That it's possible that was his job, be chief executioner. And really, no matter what title you give him, whether Potiphar is captain of the bodyguard or captain of the guard, but you can imagine Potiphar was nobody you should fool with. He was a seasoned military man. He had power over life and death in Pharaoh's administration. There was no mention of time here. We don't know how long it took for Potiphar to discover that Joseph was recognized, that there was something different about him. He was 17, we know, at some point, and then he gets there, and he's found favor, and he ends up taking charge. We don't know how long that took. We don't know if Joseph made a bunch of stupid mistakes and Potiphar was patient with him. We don't know if he was just given little teeny jobs, and as he did those really well. Maybe he was in charge of cleaning the cells of the prison or something like that. Maybe if he was the chief execution, maybe he was in charge of getting rid of bodies or cleaning up blood. I mean, who knows what the little stuff he started with. There are so many people in this world that are so afraid to start small. They're so afraid of it. I've talked to people that are living in their cars because they don't want to work at a fast food place. That's too small. And we get into this visions of grandeur that we should be able to just walk into an office and get paid an executive salary. I just want to be an executive, that's all. And they don't want to work hard for it, sacrifice for it, spend the time in it. And I think Joseph, I believe, worked his way up. There's no mention of all the mental or emotional or cultural adjustments the guy had to make. I mean, he was a peasant shepherd. Then he's a slave. And now he's got the sophistication of handling all of Potiphar's household. So something changed there. He had to have worked his way up or he wouldn't know all these things. So how did it happen? I'm assuming Joseph had probably some God-given gifts. He probably had the gift of administration or leadership or organization. But the text makes it clear that God graciously blesses Joseph, making him successful, giving him favor in Potiphar's eyes. It emphasizes that God is the source to Joseph's success. God's favor takes Joseph to the top. The writer wants us to see that God gave him the ability. He fit in. He related. He spoke the language, exercised his administrative gifts, and he finds favor in Potiphar's eyes. It wasn't a matter of talent and industriousness. It wasn't luck. God's favor took Joseph to the top. And apparently one look at Joseph, someone could see that God was with him. Can that be said of us? Do they look at you and go, God is doing something in you? Potiphar noticed Joseph had this kind of it factor going on. And he hired him. And in fairly short order, all of a sudden he's in charge of the whole household. So something's going on here. Excuse me. And as God graciously blessed Joseph, he blessed everything under Joseph's care. Now, if you were ever a business owner, or you're in that position to hire someone, and you know of someone who's faithful to the Lord, you know, a lot of businesses, and I hope we're getting away from this, a lot of times would only hire someone with a college degree. Now, I'm not against college degrees. I think it's wonderful. But if you don't work hard and get along with people, none of that matters. And the college degree is a good thing. A lot of bosses want that college degree, not because they care about what degree you got it in. They just want to know for 4 years you actually showed up and finished something. That's what they're doing. And sometimes you just got to be faithful yourself and show up. Now, because the Lord was with Joseph and prospering and blessing him, it doesn't mean that he didn't face any trials or temptations. So let's move on, excuse me, to verse 6 in Genesis 39. So Joseph was well-built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." It's kind of blunt, isn't it? I remember that Top Gun, in the movie Top Gun. Remember, Meg Ryan says, "Take me to bed or lose me forever." She's talking to her husband. That's how blunt this one is. Come to bed with me. She just makes it known. Now, you got to remember, she's a person in authority, so she had the authority to say that. But Joseph refused, it says in verse 8. He says, "With me in charge," he told her, "my master doesn't concern himself with anything in this house. And everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in his house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left the cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Now remember, Joseph is at the top, and he remains faithful to God, which is actually a very amazing sequence. To fully appreciate what's happening, we have to remember that Joseph is a young man. Oh, that'd be great. Thank you. Young man, you never have to wait. Thank you. He's a young man in his 20s, so he's naive. He's young. But he's also, thank you so much. Thanks. He's very intelligent. And he's faithful. But he's also a red-blooded, we would call him a red-blooded American male, but he's not American. Potiphar's wife was pulling out all the stops. And you can bet she would have probably put on some perfumes, a nice seductive dress, wore the finest fragrances, had the lotions on. She probably used her body, the environment, the time of day, or maybe even her power as Potiphar's wife in order to manipulate Joseph. This is an attack. She is going in for the kill on this young boy. That should be impressive right there, that he's not caving at like 20, 21 years old. She notices him and doesn't mess around with subtle flirting. She doesn't extend eye contact. She takes direct approach. "Come to bed with me." And Joseph was in a job where he could have done it. Take advantage of it. No big deal. He had the position, the authority. He could have hidden it from everyone. Apart from Potiphar, these are the two most powerful people in the household. They could have easily carried on an affair and have been covered up. And here's the stunning thing about Joseph. Though he's powerful, influential, and in charge of everything, pride and success does not blind him to boundaries and limits. It's amazing. He remains humble. He recognizes though he's successfully in charge of everything else Potiphar owns, he has no right to his wife. I'm thinking of some politicians, CEOs, entertainment personalities that should have taken a lesson from Joseph. It has been said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Sometimes it's assumed that the greatest challenges come when we're just young and starting out. Before we experience any success, power, influence. But that is not always true. Abraham Lincoln said it this way: "Nearly all men can stand adversity. But if you want to test a man's character, give him power." Chuck Swindoll comments on Joseph's situation and says, "Greater success leads to greater times of vulnerability. It is there that the temptress lies in wait." Makes sense, right? Joseph's in that place right now. Remember, he was on top of the world, his dad's favorite. And then he's in a pit, sold as a slave. And now he's in charge of Potiphar's stuff, and that's when the devil comes. See, track records of success can breed pride. It can subtly lure a person or an organization or a Fortune 500 company into thinking they are above the rules. Oh, man. Are we seeing that in this country now or what? You got lots of money, you got lots of power. If you're a corporation or you're in politics, you get to play by different rules. Jim Collins, a Stanford professor and author of a business classic. Many of you might have read it, Built to Last. And he also wrote Good to Great, that followed it up. And the third book, How the Mighty Fall. He demonstrates that the first stage of success, a successful company falling from its greatness, is what he calls hubris, or excessive pride that is born out of success. Bill Gates, CEO of Microsoft, echoed that reality when he said, "Success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose." There are three things that kept Joseph from falling into this temptation. Three things I want us to glean from. And this really goes to, like I was saying, all of our temptations. Don't look at this as, oh, well, that's just Joseph and that really inappropriate woman, Potiphar's wife. No, it's not. Take a look at it in your own situation. Number one, the way Joseph kept from falling into this temptation was loyalty to God and to his master. Keeping his core desire to be loyal and faithful to his boss and ultimately to God caused Joseph to be resolved. He could have allowed his power, his status, his privilege, his stressful demands to give him permission. We can all find excuses of why we fall into that sin that we've been tempted from. We think we have the right, or we need a reward, or no, this won't hurt. But he refused. He kept his head clear. He said it would hurt my boss, it would hurt God, it would hurt me. Number two, he doesn't entertain the temptation. Come to bed with me. He says no. He didn't say he thought about it. He didn't say, well, let's have lunch first. He doesn't entertain the idea. He doesn't allow himself to be deceived by her persuasion. And when it comes to sexual sin, the enemy is so subtle, seductive, sly. I mean, many of us can remember times on television when so much is different nowadays from back then. I mean, in our lifetimes, and many of your lifetimes especially, mine, I'm 60 years old, but I don't remember the original, like, I Love Lucy show or the Mary Tyler Moore show. Not Mary Tyler Moore show, Dick Van Dyke show, where they couldn't even, on television, sleep in the same bed. They had to have two twin beds in their bedroom because that would have been horrible to show on television. How far we've come. Those who get sucked into affairs or sexual sin usually deceive themselves into rationalizations. But it's not just sexual sin, it's all of our sins. We rationalize it. My spouse doesn't meet my needs, and that person does. Who will find out? We're completely alone. It's absolutely safe. Or how about, I should be able to watch this. I've worked hard all week. My wife has no interest, so I can watch it. Or how about young people? Well, we're going to get married anyway. Why wait? We just love each other. Or how about this? We need to move in together. It makes financial sense. Or how about just once and then never ever again? Or how about this one? I'm a guy, and God made me with these desires. Or no matter, let's not even talk about the desires. Let's talk about any sin. God made me this way. If he didn't want me to cave into sin, he shouldn't have made me this way. It's God's fault. James chapter 1, verse 14 alerts us to how subtle this seduction is. Each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Notice there's no blame there. When lust is... Wait a minute, where are we at? Yeah, lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Can we go back to that? Did I give the other verse? Can we go back to the other verse? There it is, there it is. But each one is tempted when he is carried by, enticed by his own lust. It's our own fault. It's not God's fault. It's not the enemy's fault. Notice that doesn't say anything about the enemy in that verse. It doesn't say anything here that we can blame it on anybody but our own. And when it talks about lust, don't just put that with sex. Lust is inappropriate desire, period. And what is it in our lives that is inappropriate desire that we've been giving into and blaming how we grew up, blaming how the world is, blaming that we got stuck? No, it's our own lust for that. And then again, it continues, it says, then when the lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. It's a perfect system. It really is. And it's why we desperately need Jesus to free us from the sin that's in us. Because look at how brilliantly it's provided for us. And we do it ourselves. We have to be aware and alert to temptations. Joseph doesn't even start down the path. He turns her down flat. Let me get out of here. He plans ahead, number 3. He plans ahead and builds intentional strategies. There have been times where Debbie and I have sat down and worked out strategies for each other's weaknesses, how we're going to protect each other and help each other. The temptation is persistent. Day after day, this gal seduces him. It's true with us, and no matter what sin we face, day after day. But Joseph builds these hedges, these guardrails and off-ramps. He's trying to figure out ways to avoid it. Daily she tries to seduce him, but in verse 10, it tells us he wouldn't even be around her anymore. Good thinking, Joe. That's good plan. Just don't even be around her. You should not even be around that person. Or if you're having a sin problem in some area, stop being around it. Then the day came when she gives up on the verbal advance and just grabs him. And he ran out, leaving his clothes behind. When the enemy tried to trap him, he ran. Paul latches onto that perfectly. It says it this way from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. It says, flee sexual immorality. Just run. Run away. Nothing wrong with it. Joseph had to be intentional and strategic. He had to make sure she wasn't in the same room with her. And he had to think ahead about what he would do if temptation came. Oh, that is such a good word right there. You have to plan for your temptation. Plan for it. What are you going to do? When my girls were little, I made them write out lists what they were willing to do with boys on dates. After you date them a month, what are you willing to do? When you're with them 2 months, what are you willing to do? When you're with them for 6 months, when they're kids, they ain't going to last more than 6 months. So you got the 6-month thing. And I would just say, when you're alone, what are you willing to do? You need to pray about it, talk to God about it, and write it down. And you write down your rules. Your rules. Then when a boy would come out and want to date with him, I would always say, now listen, she's got a set of rules. And let me tell you something, don't make her go against those rules. He goes, well, what are they? I said, you don't get to know. In fact, my girls didn't let me know what their rules were. And frankly, it's between them and God. I was just fine with that. But here was the thing. I would say, Alicia, Rebecca, stay true to your rules. This is what you set the standard in. And any boy who's willing to compromise when you say no to these, you're not going to do that because you have these rules here, then he's compromising who you are and your covenant with your God. You stay true to those. Don't make your rules up in the back seat of a car. Make the rules now and stick to it. It's a covenant between you and God. It's sometimes difficult for especially teenagers, but really any of us, to realize we have to be proactive against sin. We cannot just sit back and be defensive on sin. Sometimes we got to go on the offense against it. You have to plan ahead. So God's favor takes Joseph to the top. And the top, Joseph remains faithful to God. So Joseph is faithful to God. He has worked his butt off from being a slave to now in charge of everything. And let's see what God rewards this faithful man of God. Genesis 39, verse 13 says, when she saw that she had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called to her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought to us just came to me, made sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. And when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. And Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, and the place where the king's prisoners were confined. His faithfulness to God took Joseph to the bottom. I want us to understand something about this whole part of this story, though, here. Normally, and I saw a good movie that displayed this really well. Normally, the penalty for what Joseph was being accused of was death. It wasn't prison. This is the executioner's, chief executioner's wife, who says, this guy came in and tried to rape me. That's really the King James. We have a nice PG-13 version going on here. But to be honest with you, that's what was going on. And Potiphar should have just gone off with his head. I'm done with this guy. But why did he put him in prison? And I think it's because it said earlier on that Potiphar knew God was with Joseph. Potiphar's seen the faithfulness of Joseph. And no matter what anybody else might have said to him about putting him to death, I think Potiphar said, I just can't kill the guy. I wonder if Potiphar even believed his wife. Think of the character of Joseph against this woman, all of a sudden completely out of character of Joseph. Why would he do that? There's something to be said for consistency in your character. You might not think you have to act a certain way all the time and be faithful and consistent all the time, but there might be a time when someone looks back and goes, that's not you. That's not who this person is. I'd been in the district for over 25 years in Northern California, Nevada district, and someone accused me of something, and I was in a meeting with my board and our superintendent, and the superintendent looked at me and said, Eric, are you going to take care of this? And I said, absolutely. And he goes, okay. And then the other guy turned and said, well, what if he doesn't? What if he doesn't? My superintendent looked at him and said, I don't think you understand who you're talking to. If Eric Hansen says he will take care of it, he will take care of it. End of discussion. It wasn't because of that instant. It was because of the 25 years of being consistent. It's why it's so important for us to constantly be this way, because you don't know what down the road someone's going to say about you. You don't know about down the road what you might face. And let's just think about the testimony you have available to you just by being consistent. That's why I think he wasn't killed. Faithfulness to God takes Joseph to the bottom. The integrity, the uprightness that enabled Joseph to find favor now led to defaming and disfavor. I mean, I could just see Joseph I mean, in his head, he had to have gone, this isn't fair. I didn't do anything wrong. I mean, we don't see it in the Word, but is he in prison, look up at God and go, really? First the pit? Then I'm in slavery? So I do everything right? I'm brought to the top and you put me in jail, God? Really? For something I didn't even do? How about this phrase? No good deed goes unpunished. It's not in the Bible. It's not true. It's like, remember that when God helps those who helps themselves? Yeah, that's from Gene Hackman in the Poseidon Adventure. It's not in the Bible. I don't think the saying that no good deed goes unpunished was around in Joseph's time. But I wonder if he felt like that. So this is what I get when I'm obedient and I'm faithful to God. Sometimes I think we subtly expect immediate blessings and favor from God coming to us and saying, well, you did something right, so here's your reward. Don't we want that? Okay, God, I'm following your rules. Take care of me. Hey, God, I gave a little bit more in my tithe than I normally do. Where's my cash? Come on, God. Dance for me. This is how I want you to do it. Come on, I'm going to rub the little bottle and make my wishes. That's what we do. Here's another lesson for us. After doing what is right and resisting evil, don't be confused by the immediate results. You could do everything right. You can put everything in the right place at the right time, say the right things, and you can lose your job. You can lose a friendship. You can lose acceptance by a group. You can be ridiculed. You can be bumped out of the club or overlooked for a promotion. You may be the only one who's not doing it, but let me encourage you, then be the only one. If you're the only one being faithful to God, be the only one. I've been told over and over again by seminars and by pastors of big churches that this is how you fill your church. You gotta make it mighty. First of all, you tear out the pews. You got to get rid of those pews, and you got to put in chairs or even tables. You've got to do things differently. People got to come in expecting. I'll never forget one guy, Andy Stanley, one time said to me personally when I was waiting in line talking to him, he said, you know what you got to do? You got to make sure that if they're not saved, if there are non-Christians in your congregation, that they still get something useful out of the message. And there's this word in the Old Testament. It's called baloney. And I just don't believe it. Because I'm not here to preach self-help and make you feel good and give you something to use. I'm here to preach the gospel, right or wrong, and the whole gospel. And I'm sorry if that includes wrath, sin, death, but it also has faithfulness and mercy and love and eternity with God. And I just believe that. If you're the only one who's faithful, be the only one. God's favor took Joseph to the top, where his faithfulness to God takes him to the bottom. We go on. By what Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. Once again, God is so consistent, isn't he? He was with him in the pit. He was with him in slavery. He was when he was in the house. And now God is with him in prison. The Lord was with him, and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Sound familiar? We're going back again. Consistency. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all that was held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph, and he gave him success in whatever he did. Once again, God's favor follows him and takes him to the top of the bottom. Once again, God doesn't leave. God doesn't leave us. You can still find favor to God even when you're at the bottom. I had a good friend of mine's father who I absolutely love, Mr. Granger, and he would look up. He would say this to his kids all the time. When you're so far, you're looking up to see the bottom. God is still there. God is still there when you are so low, you have to look up to see the bottom. God's favor followed him and takes him to the top of the bottom. Now, we don't know how Joseph felt immediately. I mean, that had to feel pretty cruddy. After his obedience to God, he was rewarded with the dungeon. But he questioned it. But I think he recovered quickly. He chose to remember in the darkness of the dungeon what God had taught him in the light of Potiphar's palace. And the favor of God followed Joseph's faithfulness. And it takes him to the top of the bottom. And amazingly, Joseph doesn't whine or complain or get angry of God. Now, we don't hear that, so I got to believe it. It makes me admire Joseph way more because I know I'd be sulking and mad at God. I'd be sitting in that prison so furious I did everything right, and look where you put me, God. I'd be blaming God. Instead of following his confusion about the turn of events to drive a wedge between him and God, he seems to actually trust God through the trial. He holds in view the reality that God's favor was with him at the top, and now it'll be with him at the bottom. That is a wonderful reassurance. If Joseph took that attitude, which I believe he did, how far would that get you through life, knowing no matter what you're in, God's favor can follow me? And he was right. Instead of despairing in the dungeon, he remains faithful. And what happens? God's favor follows him there. Now, of course, Joseph can't see where all this is going. See, that's the advantage we have all the time. We know how this thing ends. But you got to remember, in Joseph's time, when he was in there, he didn't know. And maybe some of you today are in that situation where you don't know how this is going to end. You're trying to stay faithful to God. You're trying to do what's right. You're trying to be consistent. And all hell is breaking loose in your home and in your health or whatever. And you're wondering, is God really there? I'm going to believe that he maybe even just held on to his dream. What have you forgotten that God has promised you? What have you left behind in this saying, well, God is doing this thing over here? Yeah, but did you leave his faithfulness back here? I mean, why would God take you to a place and then leave you? I remember Debbie and I had that conversation with God. We had it together. Why would God lead us to Pine Grove in California, this tiny little town of 3,700 people? Why would he leave us there alone? And then when we were coming to Missouri and we didn't know that much what was going on, we had that lesson from Pine Grove that said no matter where he takes us, he's going to be with us. He's given us so much favor everywhere we go. We can go to Missouri and just go there. It doesn't matter because God is with us. It seems Joseph sensed that God's favor was with him in all of this when he said, it's almost like, insert your name here. Joseph, you're mine. Just wait, I'm with you. I'm not ignoring you, not rejecting you or giving up on you. You will be better. I'm preparing you for what I have in store for you. That is one of the greatest promises from God. When you think of him preparing you for where he's bringing you. No matter what you're going through right now, it could be good, it could be bad. But if you think of it in a way that God is preparing you for what is to come, you'll endure. Joseph had to learn that his life was in God's hands. He had learned to trust God through the trials at the top, and now he's going to trust him through the trials at the bottom. The scene from Joseph's life begins and ends with this very important phrase: the Lord was with him. God's favor followed his faithfulness, and the Lord was with him. Don't ever forget the truth that God says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Don't forget the truth and the confidence that says, the Lord is my helper and I will not be afraid. God's favor follows faithfulness. It sustains you as you trust him through temptations and through trials. Let's all stand to our feet, and I really want you to just, when you stand, close your eyes. And I want you to just think of those things that have, close your eyes and start thinking of those things that have held you back. Those temptations, those trials. And I want you to remember that God was with you through all of that, and he's with you now. And God is saying, I want to help you. I want to be with you. You are mine. Just wait. I'm with you. I'm not ignoring you. I'm not rejecting you. I'm not giving up on you. You are going to be better. And I'm preparing you for what I have in store for you. Father, I pray that that sinks into all of our hearts, that it quickens our spirit when we need it. That regardless of whatever trial or temptation we're in the middle of, that we can look upon you, God, and say, you've been faithful all along. And you'll be faithful through this. I believe that's why your word is so powerful in the Lord's Prayer, where it says, keep us from temptation. Deliver us from the evil one. God, we need your help. Because this world has been designed to tear us down. Not originally, but Satan has come in and manipulated everything. And we live in a world where there's temptation everywhere, there's sin everywhere. They make it hard to be faithful to you and easy to be faithful to the culture. We need your help, God. We need your reassurance that you're always with us. We need to believe your word when it says you'll never forsake us. We need to rely on you because you're our helper. Father, if there's someone here today that just needs that encouragement where they're at, they feel like they're at the bottom and not at the top of the bottom. They just feel like they're at the bottom. They're so low at the bottom that they're having to look up to see the bottom. That, God, it says in your word, you are the lifter of our heads. I don't know who I'm speaking to this morning, but you feel like you can only go lower. And that was never God's intention. His intention is to grab you, to move you, and to have you grab him and run to him and trust him that he will use all this for his glory and for his good. That no matter what has happened to you, he can use your situation for what he has in store for you in the future. Father, bring that comfort to those today that need to hear that word. Let this be a day where we walk out with our heads up, knowing you're our helper. We will not be afraid. And we can remain faithful and consistent and